What if the royal child you thought you knew wasn't who you were told she was? What if behind the polished smiles, the carefully staged photographs, and the fairy tale story lay a secret so explosive it could fracture the monarchy's fragile image forever? Tonight, we step into a story that has gripped the world with whispers, speculation, and now, a shocking reappearance. A woman claiming to be the true biological mother of Lilibet Diana, the daughter of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The question isn't just whether she's telling the truth. The question is, what happens if she is? From the very beginning, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's journey into parenthood has been wrapped in secrecy, contradiction, and speculation. Archie Harrison's birth already raised eyebrows with its unusual handling, but with Lilibet Diana, things reached an entirely new level. Unlike the royals before them, Meghan and Harry chose a path of silence, privacy, and distance. But silence, in a world hungry for transparency, often breeds suspicion. And suspicion has now led us here, to a story too wild, too shocking, and too dangerous to ignore. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Think about it for a moment. Why would the couple who constantly courted publicity suddenly slam the brakes when it came to the birth of their daughter? Why no proud hospital steps photo? No official announcements beyond carefully worded press statements. No glimpses of doctors or medical staff. And why, years later, would a woman suddenly emerge, claiming that the child the world knows as Lilibet Diana is not Meghan's biological daughter at all, but hers? Tonight, we're going to unravel this tale thread by thread. But first, let's start with an image. Imagine a young woman, standing in the shadows, her face partially hidden, her voice trembling as she utters words that could unravel royal history. She's mine. That's my daughter, and I want her back. Now, ask yourself, how would Meghan Markle react to such a claim? Would she laugh it off? Would she dismiss it? Or would she panic, realizing that her perfectly curated narrative was about to collapse like a house of cards? But before we dive deep, let's pause and reflect on why this story matters now. In an era where the monarchy has faced scandal after scandal, from Prince Andrew's controversies to endless battles between Harry and his family, the crown is more vulnerable than ever. Meghan and Harry, once heralded as the fresh, modern faces of royalty, are now often painted as the villains of their own soap opera. And into that storm walks a woman with a claim that could destroy everything Meghan has built for herself in California. If she is telling the truth, then not only is Lilibet's very identity in question, but so is Meghan's. And in the world of royals, identity is everything. Let's rewind to when Meghan first revealed her second pregnancy. Do you remember how it was announced? Not with a royal press release, not with Buckingham Palace's dignified words, but with a staged photo shoot released to the media. A dreamy picture of Meghan resting her head on Harry's lap, a flowing dress framing her baby bump. It was intimate, poetic, and designed to feel authentic. Yet to many, it raised more questions than it answered. Was it real? Was it staged? And why did this announcement feel less like a family moment and more like a production? Now, compare that to the birth itself. No official photographs from a hospital. No immediate details released to the press. Instead, we were told Lilibet was born in California, in a private, quiet hospital, attended by staff whose names never made the light of day. Doesn't that strike you as odd? In a family where births are not only documented but celebrated, this silence was deafening. And where there is silence, rumors always fill the void. The whispers began quietly, that Meghan had used a surrogate, that she had staged her pregnancy appearances, that she was hiding something. And while these rumors were dismissed by some as the cruel inventions of tabloids, others began to notice inconsistencies. Photos of Meghan where her bump appeared to shift, flatten, or grow overnight. Public appearances that seemed carefully choreographed. And most importantly, the absolute absence of transparency when it came to Lilibet's birth. These weren't just coincidences, they were fuel for suspicion. Now, imagine the impact when years later, a woman surfaces, claiming that she is Lilibet's biological mother. Imagine the shockwaves this would send through the public, through the press, and most of all, through Meghan herself. This isn't just gossip. This is a direct challenge to the very foundation of Meghan's motherhood. And in the ruthless arena of public opinion, Once the seed of doubt is planted, it grows. It spreads. It consumes. But let me ask you this. Why would a woman risk ridicule, lawsuits, and public shaming to make such a claim unless she believed she had proof? What could she possibly gain, unless the truth was on her side? And what if she did have evidence, documents, hospital records, even photographs, that contradicted Meghan's carefully guarded narrative? If you think this sounds like the plot of a Hollywood thriller, you're not alone. But remember, reality has a way of being stranger than fiction. And in this case, the stakes couldn't be higher. Because if this woman is right, then Meghan Markle, the actress who married into royalty, the woman who reshaped her image from television star to duchess to global activist, could be exposed as someone who orchestrated the most audacious cover-up in modern royal history. And if she's wrong, then Meghan and Harry are once again the victims of a cruel, unrelenting world that refuses to let them live in peace. Either way, the drama is irresistible. Picture Meghan right now, sitting in her California mansion, scrolling through headlines that scream with words like biological mother, custody battle, truth revealed. Imagine the panic, the anger, the fear. Because Meghan knows better than anyone that perception is power. And once the public begins to doubt, it doesn't matter what the truth is, the damage is already done. And this is where the story twists. Because this isn't just about Meghan. This isn't just about Harry. This is about the monarchy itself. What would happen if one of its newest heirs turned out to be the child of another woman entirely? Would the palace step in? Would they fight for the truth? Or would they cover it up to protect the institution at all costs? History has shown us that the monarchy has buried scandals before. Illegitimate children, secret affairs, hidden truths. Why would this be any different? But here's the part that should chill you. The woman who claims to be Lilibet's biological mother isn't just whispering her story to friends. She's stepping forward. She's demanding to be heard. And in doing so, she has thrown Meghan Markle into the fight of her life. What comes next isn't just another royal rumor. It's a battle that could redefine Meghan's legacy, Harry's loyalty, and Lilibet's very identity. Because the moment this woman said, "She's mine," nothing could ever be the same again. And yet, this is only the beginning. Because what she revealed next would shake everything to its core. The moment the mystery woman stepped into the light, whispers became a storm. One voice, one claim, and suddenly the carefully guarded life Meghan and Harry had built in California was thrown into chaos. Imagine it. A woman who until then had remained invisible, anonymous, suddenly declaring that the daughter the world knows as Lilibet Diana is not Meghan's at all. That single sentence didn't just spark speculation. It ignited a firestorm that began to consume everything in its path. But let's rewind for a moment. To understand the magnitude of this revelation, we have to go back to when Meghan and Harry first carved out their new lives in America. After leaving the royal family in 2020, they built a narrative of independence, privacy, and control. Gone were the rigid palace protocols and centuries-old traditions. Instead, they became masters of their own story, or so they thought. In Montecito, shielded by high walls and surrounded by Hollywood elites, Meghan and Harry tried to present themselves as modern royals, unshackled by the crown, free to raise their children without scrutiny. But privacy, in their case, became the very thing that drew suspicion. You see, with Archie, there had already been signs that something wasn't quite right. His birth was shrouded in secrecy. No public hospital steps moment, no immediate photos, not even clarity on who delivered him. At the time, many dismissed it as Meghan and Harry simply rejecting tradition. But then, when Lilibet arrived, that same silence grew deafening. Where were the doctors? Where were the witnesses? Where was the transparency that royal births usually demand? Instead, there was nothing but polished press statements and a conspicuous lack of detail. And that's exactly why, when this so-called biological mother came forward, people listened. Because the ground had already been laid with doubt. The inconsistencies were already there, waiting to be seized upon. Think about it. If Meghan and Harry had followed the usual royal script, hospital photos, official announcements, medical staff acknowledgments, would this woman's words have carried the same weight? Probably not. But in the vacuum of information, her voice echoed louder than anyone could have imagined. Now let's talk about her. Who is she? How did she suddenly emerge from the shadows? At first, She was described only as a mystery woman. No name, no face, just an explosive claim. And in the world of royal gossip, that's enough to fuel headlines for weeks. But this wasn't the kind of tabloid chatter you could brush off with a quick denial. Her story wasn't vague. It was precise. She knew dates. She knew details. She knew things only someone directly involved would know. That's what made people sit up and pay attention. Imagine Meghan reading this story for the first time. For years, she's carefully controlled her public image, crafting narratives in interviews, producing documentaries, even curating her personal appearances to fit the role she wanted the world to see. Now, suddenly, all of that work is under threat because of one woman's words. Can you picture the fury? The panic? The late-night conversations between Meghan and Harry, trying to figure out how to contain this before it spirals out of control? And here's where it gets even more interesting. While Meghan's instinct may have been to dismiss the claim outright, Harry's position would have been far more complicated. For Meghan, this was an attack on her credibility, her image, her identity as a mother. But for Harry, it was personal. This was his daughter, his family, his chance to prove he could create a life outside the monarchy. And now, someone was threatening to rip that apart. The pressure on him must have been unbearable. Do you fight back? Do you stay silent? Or do you start questioning the very people around you? The media, of course, had a field day. Within hours, headlines around the world carried the story. Some framed it as a cruel hoax, others as a possible scandal that could eclipse even the darkest moments in royal history. Remember, this is a family that has survived abdications, affairs, divorces, and scandals. But the claim that a royal child isn't who she is supposed to be, that's different. That strikes at the very heart of the monarchy's stability. Because if the identity of one royal heir can be called into question, what does that mean for the rest? But let me ask you, what would make you believe a claim like this? Would it be the woman's confidence? The way her story matched the gaps in Meghan's timeline? Or would it be the strange silence from Meghan and Harry themselves? Because here's the thing, the more they refused to address it, the more suspicious it looked. If it was nothing but lies, why not crush it immediately? Why let it fester? Why let it grow? And this is where the cracks in Meghan's narrative began to widen. People went back and re-examined old photographs, old videos, old statements. They noticed how Meghan's baby bump seemed to change shape from one day to the next. They remembered the stories of staff members being gagged from speaking about the births. They recalled how Meghan had once claimed privacy was her right, even while living off public attention. Suddenly, the dots started to connect in ways they hadn't before. And once people start connecting dots, it's almost impossible to stop them. For Meghan, the arrival of this mystery woman wasn't just a nuisance. It was a direct threat to everything she'd built. And yet, no matter how hard she tried to suppress it, the story wouldn't die. In fact, it grew stronger. Reporters began digging deeper. Commentators began speculating. And royal insiders began whispering things they had never dared to say out loud. One even went so far as to suggest that Meghan had rewritten the timeline of her pregnancies to suit her narrative. Whether true or not, it was explosive. Because once the public begins to doubt you, every inconsistency becomes evidence. And that's exactly what happened here. The mystery woman's claim wasn't treated as an isolated rumor. It was treated as the missing piece of a puzzle that people had been trying to solve for years. That's why it spread like wildfire. And that's why Meghan and Harry suddenly found themselves facing a nightmare they couldn't control. But here's the kicker. This woman wasn't going away. She had more to say, more to reveal. And the longer Meghan stayed silent, the more power the woman gained. The world was waiting, watching, demanding answers. And Meghan knew that if she didn't find a way to shut this down, her entire life in California, the deals, the fame, the influence, could crumble in an instant. Because the truth, whether real or manufactured, is like a wildfire. And this fire had only just begun to burn. But the real shock came when the woman didn't just tell her story, she offered proof. And that's when Meghan realized the situation was far more dangerous than she ever imagined. Why was Lilibet's birth treated so differently from Archie's? Why was there such a shroud of secrecy, such an iron curtain of silence, around the arrival of a royal baby who, by tradition, should have been celebrated with transparency and ceremony? These are the questions that haunted the public from the very beginning. And when the so-called biological mother stepped forward, Those unanswered questions came roaring back into the spotlight. Suddenly, the silence wasn't just strange, it was suspicious. Let's look at Archie first. Even though Meghan and Harry were already shifting away from royal protocols, the world still expected a certain degree of openness when he was born. Yes, there were oddities. No immediate hospital steps moment. No clear confirmation of the attending doctors. But at least some information was made public. The palace, after all, had to release details, even if reluctantly. There were still photographs, announcements, and the traditional public acknowledgement of a new royal heir. But with Lilibet? Nothing. Absolutely nothing except carefully worded press releases. No smiling parents outside the hospital. No details about the doctors or nurses who delivered her. No official confirmation from medical staff. Instead, the world was told she was born in a private California hospital, and then the shutters came down. Silence. Curtain closed. And in that silence, rumors grew. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would Meghan and Harry go to such extreme lengths to conceal something that should have been joyful, even historic? Was it really just about privacy? Or was there something they desperately didn't want the world to see? Because here's the truth, secrecy invites suspicion. And in this case, it was the perfect breeding ground for speculation. From the moment of Lilibet's birth, whispers circulated about surrogacy. People pointed out how Meghan's public baby bump seemed inconsistent, sometimes round, sometimes oddly flat, sometimes appearing to shift in position. They noticed how her maternity appearances felt staged, as if choreographed for maximum photographic impact rather than genuine candidness. And when no hospital photos surfaced, when no staff spoke out, those whispers became louder. And then came the most damning detail of all, the media blackout. Unlike Archie's birth, which at least generated photographs and some official communication, Lilibet's arrival was cloaked in total darkness. Reporters who tried to dig for details were met with silence or stone walls. Hospital records were impossible to verify. The palace gave nothing. Meghan and Harry remained guarded. Doesn't that strike you as unusual? Why were they so determined to keep every aspect of her birth hidden? It's here that the theory of a surrogate gained real traction. If Meghan hadn't carried Lilibet herself, if another woman had, then that would explain the secrecy. That would explain the refusal to release hospital details. That would explain why Meghan seemed more intent on controlling the narrative than on celebrating the moment. And into that narrative stepped the so-called biological mother. She didn't just appear out of thin air. She appeared at the very moment when suspicion was already running high, when inconsistencies had already primed the public to believe something was being hidden. And her claim, that she was the one who brought Lilibet into the world, fit too perfectly into the puzzle. It was like snapping in the missing piece that had eluded everyone for years. But here's where it gets chilling. Meghan and Harry could have immediately shut this down. They could have released the hospital records. They could have allowed the doctors to speak. They could have produced undeniable evidence that Meghan had carried and delivered her daughter. But they didn't. And by choosing silence, they made the story stronger. Because silence, in this case, was read as guilt. The media, hungry for answers, pounced. Articles began to compare Meghan's pregnancy timelines. Commentators noted the odd differences between how Archie's birth was handled versus Lilibet's. Even royal insiders began leaking hints that something about Lilibet's birth was off. Each new report added fuel to the fire. And then came the critical moment, when the so-called biological mother spoke publicly for the first time. She didn't hedge. She didn't suggest. She declared. Her words were firm, confident, and specific. I am Lilibet Diana's real mother. Imagine the shockwaves that sent through the press. Suddenly, this wasn't just speculation or online gossip. This was a direct, undeniable claim. And people couldn't look away. But why now? Why did she wait? Some speculated she had been silenced before, paid off, perhaps, or pressured into staying quiet. Others suggested she was waiting for the perfect moment, when Meghan and Harry were most vulnerable, most isolated from the royal institution that once protected them. Whatever the reason, her timing was perfect, and the public was ready to listen. Think about the irony here. Meghan and Harry had fled the UK to escape the intrusive British press, to carve out a life of privacy in America. Yet it was in California, surrounded by Hollywood's glitz and global media power, that their greatest secret allegedly unraveled. Privacy, the very thing they fought for, became the weapon that turned against them. Because in choosing secrecy, they left Spa. But let me ask you, if this woman was lying, wouldn't Meghan and Harry have crushed her immediately with evidence? Wouldn't they have used their considerable influence to shut her down, to discredit her before her words gained traction? The fact that they didn't only added credibility to her claim. And here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because once this woman's voice was out there, people began re-examining Meghan's entire pregnancy timeline with forensic intensity. They noted the inconsistencies in her public appearances. They questioned why she never wore bikinis during either pregnancy, despite living in California where paparazzi could easily have captured such moments. They recalled how Meghan's baby bump once seemed to collapse awkwardly as she crouched during an event, a moment widely circulated online, dismissed at the time, but now reframed as evidence. The theory of a surrogate was no longer a fringe conspiracy. It was mainstream discussion. And the biological mother's claim gave it a face, a voice, and a shocking level of credibility. But the real bombshell wasn't just her words. It was what she claimed to have in her possession: documents, timelines, and details that matched the inconsistencies the press had already flagged. Suddenly, this wasn't just gossip, it was potentially provable. And that terrified Meghan. Because if there's one thing Meghan has always relied on, it's her ability to control the narrative. But here was a woman she couldn't silence, a woman whose story filled the very gaps Meghan had worked so hard to conceal. For the first time, Meghan wasn't holding the pen. Someone else was writing her story. And when that happens, the ending is never certain. Because what this woman revealed next didn't just challenge Meghan's motherhood, it threatened to expose the entire royal family's complicity in keeping the secret hidden. Who exactly was this woman who had suddenly stepped out of the shadows? That's the question everyone asked the moment her story hit the headlines. She wasn't a faceless rumor anymore. She was real, and she was speaking out. And her words were too detailed, too precise, too perfectly aligned with the inconsistencies in Meghan's story to be ignored. The press called her a mystery woman, but she quickly became something much more than that. She became the embodiment of every doubt, every whisper, every suspicion people had been harboring since the day Meghan announced her pregnancy with Lilibet. And the way she told her story? It was chilling in its calm confidence. She claimed she had been connected to Meghan and Harry long before Lilibet's birth. Not as a stranger, not as some random outsider, but through what she described as a delicate arrangement. According to her, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't some wild conspiracy. This was planned. And when she described the terms, the secrecy, the promises made to her, it fit perfectly with the puzzle pieces the public had been trying to snap together for years. But here's what made people lean in closer. She didn't just talk about vague timelines. She gave specifics. She spoke of dates, appointments, meetings. She described conversations about privacy, about contracts, about what the world could and couldn't be allowed to know. And when you hear someone talk with that level of detail, it makes you wonder, how could she possibly know all this unless she was there? Let me ask you, would you dismiss someone who speaks with that much certainty? Or would you start to question everything you thought you knew about Meghan and Harry's story? Of course, Meghan's supporters were quick to label the woman a liar, an opportunist chasing fame and money. But others saw something else in her demeanor. She didn't appear desperate. She didn't appear erratic. She appeared determined. Almost as if she had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it, knowing that eventually the truth would have to come out. And then came the most startling detail of all. She claimed that when she signed the agreement to carry Lilibet, she was promised something in return: security, financial compensation, protection. But she alleged that Meghan and Harry, once they got what they wanted, cut her out completely. No follow-up, no recognition, no gratitude, nothing, just silence. She said she was discarded like she never existed. Now think about that. Meghan Markle, who has built her image on compassion, on supporting women, on being a voice for those who feel unseen, accused of silencing and discarding the very woman who may have carried her daughter. Can you see the irony? Can you see why the story struck such a nerve? And it wasn't just her words that got people talking. It was the uncanny resemblance. Some began comparing photos of Lilibet to images of the woman. The similarities, they claimed, were striking, far too striking to ignore. Social media lit up with side-by-side comparisons. People zoomed in on eyes, noses, cheekbones, even hair texture. Look closely, they urged. Doesn't she look more like this woman than Meghan? Of course, resemblance is subjective. But in a world hungry for scandal, those comparisons took on a life of their own. And once the public sees something, once they latch onto an image that seems to confirm their suspicions, it's nearly impossible to convince them otherwise. But perhaps the most devastating blow came not from her words or even her alleged resemblance to Lilibet. It came from her knowledge of Meghan's timeline. She pointed out how Meghan's public appearances didn't line up with the supposed due dates. How Meghan seemed to disappear from view at crucial moments, only to reappear with a visibly different bump size. How photographs sometimes looked altered or staged. And when she laid out her version of events, the inconsistencies that had once been shrugged off suddenly looked impossible to ignore. Let me pose the question directly. If someone came forward with a story that neatly explained every odd detail you'd noticed for years, wouldn't you at least consider the possibility that they were telling the truth? And that's exactly what happened here. Her story didn't feel random. It felt like the missing link. Meghan's response: silence. Harry's response: silence. And that silence only amplified the woman's voice. Because the longer Meghan refused to address it, the more credible the story became. If she was lying, why not shut her down immediately? Why not sue for defamation? Why not release the proof that Meghan had indeed carried Lilibet herself? The lack of action spoke volumes. Meanwhile, the press dug deeper into the woman's life. They found fragments of her past. Medical connections, possible ties to private clinics, whispers of her having been involved in surrogacy arrangements before. Nothing fully confirmed, nothing officially proven, but enough to raise eyebrows. Enough to make people wonder whether Meghan and Harry had, in fact, chosen someone discreet and then assumed they could bury her existence forever. And here's where the story takes an even darker twist. The woman claimed that she had tried to stay quiet for years, that she had honored her end of the deal. But something changed. Something made her come forward now. She spoke of betrayal, of being denied what was promised, of watching from the sidelines as Meghan presented herself to the world as Lilibet's mother while she, her real mother, as she claimed, was erased from the narrative. It's a story dripping with betrayal, with irony, with dramatic tension. Meghan, once hailed as a feminist icon, accused of exploiting another woman's body and then silencing her. Harry, the man who fled the palace to protect his family, now accused of hiding the truth about who that family really is. And at the center of it all, a child, Lilibet Diana, caught in a storm she never asked for. But here's the most explosive part. The woman didn't just tell her story. She hinted that she had evidence. And not just vague claims, real, tangible evidence. Documents, records, proof that could validate everything she was saying. And if she produced those, then Meghan's silence wouldn't just look suspicious. It would look damning. But here's the twist no one saw coming. The woman's story wasn't just about Meghan. It wasn't just about Harry. It hinted at something larger, something darker. She suggested that other people knew, that there was more than just a personal cover-up, that this was a coordinated effort, one that reached higher than anyone imagined. And that revelation changed everything. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about one woman's word against Meghan Markle's. It was about the possibility of a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the walls of Montecito. Meghan Markle's silence was deafening. When the mystery woman spoke, the world expected Meghan to strike back immediately, to issue a firm denial, to produce proof that would obliterate the claim before it gained traction. But she didn't. Days passed, then weeks. And in that silence, a dangerous question began to take root. Was Meghan hiding something? Her public reaction, or rather, her lack of it, was the first signal that this scandal wasn't going to vanish with a press release. Instead of addressing the claim head-on, Meghan retreated into the very same strategy she had once criticized the royal family for using: denial through silence. When she and Harry accused the palace of failing to speak up for them against tabloid smears, Meghan painted herself as a victim of an uncaring institution. Yet now, faced with her own potential scandal, she adopted the palace playbook. Say nothing. Let the storm pass. Hope people move on. But storms don't pass when the thunder only grows louder. Behind closed doors, Meghan was said to be furious. She knew how dangerous this was. For years, she had worked tirelessly to craft her image, not just as Harry's wife, not just as a duchess, but as a mother. Motherhood was central to her identity, her brand, her story. And now that identity was being ripped apart by one woman's words. Her PR team scrambled, weighing their options. Should Meghan speak? Should she sue? Should she release documents? Each choice carried risks. Each choice could backfire. And then there was Harry. His reaction was said to be far more emotional. For him, this wasn't just about image. It was about his daughter. Harry had lived his life in the shadow of speculation about his own parentage, with cruel rumors about James Hewitt haunting him since childhood. Now he faced a new nightmare. Whispers that his daughter's identity wasn't what he believed. Imagine the torment. Imagine the sleepless nights, the paranoia, the endless questions. Could he really trust the story he'd been told? Or had he, too, been misled? This moment wasn't just about Meghan versus the mystery woman. It was about Harry's deepest fear repeating itself. His whole life, he had been plagued by doubts about where he came from. And now, just as he tried to create a new life in America, those doubts were reborn in the cruelest way possible, through his own child. And here's where history repeats itself. Because the royal family has a long tradition of scandals involving hidden heirs, illegitimate children, and concealed affairs. Go back through the centuries, and you'll find stories of kings who fathered children out of wedlock, of queens who faked pregnancies, of surrogates and stand-ins brought in to ensure a line of succession. The monarchy has always thrived on secrecy, and whenever secrecy cracks, chaos follows. For example, in the 17th century, whispers about James II's heir being smuggled into the royal bedchamber in a warming pan nearly sparked a civil war. The public simply didn't believe the official story. They believed the baby wasn't the queen's. Sound familiar? That's the eerie parallel people drew when this woman came forward about Lilibet. History, it seemed, was repeating itself, only this time, in the glare of a global media circus. But here's the cruel irony. Meghan and Harry had left the palace to escape the very secrecy they now stood accused of practicing. They had fled to California promising honesty, transparency, authenticity. And yet, when faced with this claim, they closed ranks tighter than the monarchy ever did. It was hypocrisy laid bare, and the press devoured it. Every newspaper headline, every tabloid column, every social media thread seized on the inconsistencies. Meghan had always prided herself on controlling the narrative, but suddenly, the narrative was controlling her. Reporters began digging into the timeline of Meghan's pregnancy with Lilibet. They found oddities. For instance, Meghan announced her pregnancy in February 2021 with that famous black and white photo taken by Miss Harriman. But when journalists compared the announcement to her supposed due date, they noticed the timeline didn't quite add up. Some argued her bump size seemed inconsistent with the stage of pregnancy she claimed to be in. Others noted her sudden absences from public appearances during key months. And then came the bombshell. Insiders leaked that certain staff members who worked with Meghan during that time had been forced to sign unusually strict non-disclosure agreements, stricter than those typically used even within the royal household. Why the secrecy? What were they hiding? The more people dug, the stranger the picture became. And every inconsistency, every unanswered question, seemed to validate the mystery woman's story. Now, let's pause for a moment. Imagine being Meghan. Imagine watching this unfold, day by day, headline by headline, knowing the world is whispering about whether you are truly your daughter's mother. The pressure would be unbearable. The rage, the fear, the desperation, it must have been suffocating. And yet, she still refused to speak. Why? That was the question on everyone's lips. Why wouldn't Meghan simply release proof to shut this down? Some suggested she couldn't. Others suggested she wouldn't, because doing so might expose even bigger secrets. Either way, her silence was her downfall. Harry, meanwhile, was spiraling. Those close to him claimed he was torn between his instinct to protect his wife and his desperate need to protect his daughter. But how do you protect your child when the very foundation of her story is being questioned? Harry's once fiery defiance seemed to crumble under the weight of doubt. And then came the turning point. Reporters digging into Meghan's timeline stumbled across a shocking inconsistency, one so glaring it couldn't be explained away. Meghan had claimed to be in her third trimester at a time when photographs suggested otherwise. The dates didn't line up. The appearances didn't line up. And suddenly, the whispers became accusations. Because if Meghan had lied about her timeline, what else had she lied about? This was no longer about a single woman's claim. This was about whether Meghan Markle herself had staged her pregnancy from the very beginning. And the closer the press looked, the more cracks they found. But the most explosive detail wasn't unearthed by reporters. It came directly from the woman herself. Because when she was pressed for more, she revealed something that changed everything. A detail so precise, so intimate, that it made denial nearly impossible. And that revelation didn't just shake Meghan. It shook Harry. It shook the palace. It shook the very foundations of the monarchy itself. Birth certificates, hospital records, medical staff sign-offs. In any ordinary case, these are the documents that confirm a child's birth, lock the details into history, and erase any doubt. But in Meghan and Harry's case, those very documents became the center of suspicion, contradiction, and whispered scandal. And when people began examining them closely, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Think about it. For Archie, there was at least a birth certificate, though even that was wrapped in secrecy. Remember how Meghan and Harry initially refused to reveal where Archie was born? Only later, after pressure, was it confirmed. And then came the odd alteration. Meghan's name on the birth certificate was changed after the fact, allegedly at Meghan's request. Already, the public saw manipulation. Already, they smelled something off. But with Lilibet? The silence was louder. Yes, a birth certificate exists, filed in Santa Barbara. But unlike typical documents, the details felt sanitized. No mention of medical staff. No specific hospital records revealed to the press. Just the bare minimum. Compare that to the birth certificates of other royals, which always included attending physicians, signatures, and precise details. Why strip that out? Why the bare-bones version? And then came the inconsistencies. Reporters noticed that the dates didn't align perfectly with Meghan's public pregnancy timeline. Hospital staff at Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital, where Meghan supposedly gave birth, were notably silent, eerily so. No leaks, no off-the-record comments, no proud announcements from doctors. In California, even celebrities who give birth in private hospitals usually have staff who speak out later. But here, nothing. A wall of silence. It was as though the entire record had been scrubbed, and that fueled the fire. Critics argued that Meghan and Harry had something to hide. Conspiracy theorists claimed the documents were falsified. Some even went so far as to suggest that Lilibet had been born elsewhere, perhaps via surrogate, and the paperwork was retroactively filed to fit the story. Now, let me ask you directly. If the documents had been straightforward and clean, would anyone believe the biological mother's claim? Probably not. But because the records themselves looked suspicious, her words carried weight. The so-called biological mother took full advantage of this. She began pointing to the gaps in the paperwork as proof of her story. She claimed the reason no attending physician was publicly named was because the birth never happened in the way Meghan said. She argued that the secrecy around hospital staff wasn't about privacy, it was about concealment. And every missing signature, every absent detail, became part of her arsenal. What made it worse was Meghan's refusal to clarify. Her PR team could have easily released redacted documents proving the birth was legitimate. They could have had a doctor step forward to confirm it. But they didn't. And in their silence, the woman's narrative thrived. Let's talk about the hospital itself. Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital is prestigious, yes. But it's not Fort Knox. People talk. Staff gossip. Yet in this case, the lid was sealed so tightly it almost looked forced. Journalists who tried to dig for information found themselves stonewalled. One even reported that hospital staff were instructed not to discuss certain high-profile patients. Why such extreme secrecy? Was it truly about privacy? Or was it because there was something unusual about the birth? And then came the most damning leak of all. Whispers of conflicting delivery details. Some insiders claimed Meghan had given birth naturally. Others said it was via C-section. Some even said she hadn't been seen in the hospital at all. The contradictions piled up, and the absence of official confirmation made each contradiction look more credible. It was in this climate of confusion that the biological mother dropped her biggest bombshell yet. She claimed she had been present at that very hospital, but not as Meghan, as herself. She claimed she had been the one on the delivery table, while Meghan remained elsewhere, preparing for the public announcement. Imagine the drama of that allegation. Imagine the fury it would. Now, whether her claim was true or not, here's the undeniable fact. The timeline didn't add up neatly. Meghan's pregnancy announcement, her public appearances, her supposed due date, and the eventual filing of the birth certificate, they all felt disjointed. And when things don't add up, people fill in the blanks. But it wasn't just paperwork that caused suspicion. There were whispers of missing signatures. Some claimed that the certificate filed for Lilibet lacked certain authenticating marks typically found on California birth documents. Whether that was true or exaggerated didn't matter. The perception was enough. Because once people believe a document has been tampered with, it becomes tainted. And here's the part that made jaws drop. In her interviews, the biological mother described the paperwork as staged. She suggested that lawyers had rushed to file it in order to cement Meghan's claim before questions could arise. She said she had been promised her name would never appear, that she would be erased from history, and that Meghan would be enshrined as the sole mother. And doesn't that sound eerily similar to how Meghan's name was erased and altered on Archie's certificate? Patterns. That's what people saw. Patterns of secrecy, patterns of concealment, patterns of rewriting official documents. The press couldn't resist digging deeper. They combed through hospital records, interviewed anonymous staff, examined California birth certificate law, and every missing detail, every unexplained gap, only seemed to support the biological mother's case. Let me ask you, if you were on a jury and you had to choose between Meghan's silence and the woman's detailed account, whose side would you lean toward? Because that's the position the public found themselves in. They weren't just gossiping anymore. They were weighing evidence. They were acting as judge and jury in the court of public opinion. And Meghan was losing. Badly. But here's where it gets even darker. Because while paperwork can be questioned, while timelines can be debated, the most explosive revelation wasn't in the documents at all. It was in the woman's own words. She claimed she had something Meghan couldn't refute. Something more powerful than birth certificates or hospital records. She claimed she had personal proof of the arrangement. Conversations, agreements, evidence that tied Meghan directly to her. And if she was telling the truth, then Meghan's entire narrative wasn't just shaky. It was on the verge of collapsing. Because what this woman revealed next wasn't just about a child's birth. It was about betrayal. Imagine sitting across from a woman who looks you dead in the eye and says, with no hesitation, "I carried that child. I brought her into this world. And they erased me." Those words, sharp and unflinching, were the ones that turned this story from rumor into a living nightmare for Meghan Markle. Because the so-called biological mother didn't just stop at vague claims. She laid out her story like someone who had lived it, step by step, detail by detail, until it felt less like gossip and more like testimony. Her voice was steady, but beneath it pulsed years of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. She described how she had been approached for what was framed as an arrangement. At the time, it sounded discreet, professional, mutually beneficial. A chance for her to help a couple desperate to grow their family, while securing financial stability for herself. She never imagined that arrangement would later feel like a theft of her very identity. She spoke of meetings in quiet offices, contracts slid across tables, and lawyers who insisted on secrecy clauses so tight they felt like shackles. She remembered being reassured that she was doing something noble, that her role would be honored in silence, and that she would walk away without ever being named. But according to her, that promise of respect was broken the moment the baby was born. From then on, she said, she was treated not like a person, but like an inconvenience to be erased. The emotion in her words cut deep. She described the physical toll of the pregnancy, the exhaustion, the nausea, the complications. She claimed that Meghan never once checked on her well-being during that time, that the Duchess was more interested in appearances, in planning how to present the story to the world, than in acknowledging the woman who bore her child. For someone who built her reputation on compassion, on sisterhood, on being a champion of women's voices, the accusation was brutal. And she didn't stop there. She hinted at payments that were promised but never fully delivered. Legal protections that were dangled in front of her, then yanked away. She spoke of betrayal not just by Meghan, but by Harry too. how he smiled in public while privately knowing the truth of what had been arranged. The sting of her words was clear. She wasn't just accusing Meghan of deception. She was accusing both of them of betrayal. Now, put yourself in Meghan's shoes for a moment. How do you counter that kind of story? If you speak, you risk validating it by giving it oxygen. If you stay silent, the woman's words grow louder, stronger, more believable. Meghan was trapped. And for a woman who had always prided herself on controlling the narrative, that loss of control must have felt like suffocation. But the real gut punch came when the woman added something that shifted the tone from accusation to devastation. She said, through tears, "I was told I would at least be acknowledged privately. That one day, when she was older, my daughter would know who I was." But that promise was broken too. Those words hit harder than any document or timeline ever could. They added something Meghan had fought desperately to avoid: humanity. Suddenly, this wasn't just about scandal. It was about a mother's pain, and the public felt it. Even those who doubted her story couldn't deny the raw emotion in her voice. Even skeptics paused when they saw her fight back tears as she described being erased from her child's life. Because at the heart of it, who wouldn't feel sympathy for a woman who believed she had lost her daughter? The irony was impossible to ignore. Meghan, who had once spoken on international stages about the importance of giving women a voice, was now accused of silencing the one woman whose voice mattered most in this story. Meghan, who positioned herself as the modern, compassionate Duchess, was being painted as the villain in another woman's tale of loss. And the contradictions only deepened. Meghan had always been vocal about her struggles with motherhood, the sleepless nights, the loneliness, the pain of being judged. Yet here was a woman claiming that Meghan had skipped the hardest part entirely, outsourcing it, then pretending it was hers all along. For Meghan's critics, it was the ultimate hypocrisy. But here's where the biological mother's story took a turn that made even her supporters uneasy. She didn't just want recognition. She said she wanted her daughter back. Those words sent shockwaves through the media. Until then, many had assumed she simply wanted her truth acknowledged, perhaps even financial restitution. But custody? That was a whole different level. And that declaration lit a fire Meghan couldn't ignore. Because now, it wasn't just about her reputation. It was about her child. The idea of a custody battle, public, messy, and drenched in scandal, was Meghan's worst nightmare. The thought of being painted as someone who had stolen another woman's child was catastrophic for her image. And more than that, the idea that Harry could lose his daughter was unbearable. But the woman didn't back down. She claimed she had rights. She claimed she had proof. She claimed she had been silent too long, and now it was time to fight. And fight she did. With every interview, every public statement, her voice grew stronger, and Meghan's silence grew weaker. The balance of power had shifted. Yet what came next wasn't just another accusation. It wasn't another tearful anecdote or vague promise of proof. It was something tangible, something undeniable. Because the woman revealed she had kept something from the arrangement. Something Meghan never expected her to hold on to. And once she unveiled it, the world would never see Meghan Markle the same way again. Meghan Markle had always been a master of the narrative. From her early days in Hollywood to her whirlwind romance with Prince Harry, she understood how to shape perception, how to bend the story in her favor. But when the so-called biological mother began speaking out with growing force, Meghan was forced to confront her most difficult challenge yet. How do you control a story that refuses to be silenced? Behind the walls of her Montecito mansion, panic set in. Publicly, Meghan projected calm, smiling in carefully staged paparazzi shots, attending select events with Harry by her side, appearing unbothered. But insiders whispered that inside her private world, she was anything but. Meetings with her PR team stretched into the early hours of the morning. Advisors debated strategies. Should they sue? Should they smear the woman? Should they release some carefully crafted proof of Meghan's pregnancy? Every option carried risks. One advisor allegedly warned her, if you sue, you give her credibility. If you stay silent, you give her power. It was the perfect catch, 22. And Meghan, who had once weaponized lawsuits against tabloids to protect her image, suddenly seemed hesitant. She had built her brand around motherhood, around being Lilibet's doting mom. To open the door to legal discovery, where documents and depositions could be demanded, was too dangerous. So Meghan chose what she always chose in crisis: optics. Control the images. Control the tone. Control what the public sees. Within days, new photographs of Meghan and Harry with Lilibet began to surface. Carefully timed, beautifully lit, dripping with warmth. It was classic Meghan. If people doubted her motherhood, she would show them images of herself as the perfect, glowing mother. A mother no one could question. But here's the irony. Those photographs, instead of silencing the whispers, fueled them. Critics argued they looked staged, as though Meghan was trying too hard to convince the world of her role. Others noted how rarely Lilibet had been seen before and how odd it was that suddenly, at the height of this scandal, new pictures appeared. To skeptics, it didn't prove Meghan's motherhood. It screamed desperation. And then came the coordinated media blitz. Friendly outlets ran glowing stories about Meghan's devotion as a mother. Profiles highlighted her daily life with the children, her tireless dedication, her protective instincts. It was PR strategy 101. Flood the public with positive stories to drown out the negative. But it wasn't working, because the woman's voice remained louder. Her claims had carved themselves into the public consciousness, and no amount of glossy coverage could erase them. Meanwhile, Harry was unraveling. Friends close to him whispered that he looked haunted, more tense and withdrawn than ever before. For a man who had always despised the press, this was his worst nightmare come true. He had believed that leaving the royal family would shield his children from scandal. Instead, his daughter was at the very heart of it, and his silence, like Meghan's, was interpreted not as strength, but as guilt. But then something shifted. A royal insider, someone with access to the family's inner circle, leaked a detail that sent the story spiraling in a new direction. The insider hinted that the palace had been aware of the arrangement from the very beginning. That Meghan's secrecy hadn't been hers alone. That higher powers had known, and had chosen to cover it up. Can you imagine the implications of that? It meant this wasn't just Meghan's scandal. It was a royal scandal. A monarchy scandal. If the insider was telling the truth, then the cover-up stretched far beyond Montecito. It stretched across the Atlantic, back to Buckingham Palace itself. The press exploded. Commentators asked, why would the palace protect Meghan after she and Harry had walked away? Why shield them if there was something to hide? Some suggested it was to avoid embarrassment. Others believed it was to prevent further fractures in an already fragile institution. After all, could the monarchy survive if it were revealed that one of its heirs had been born under a cloud of secrecy and deception? But here's where it gets even darker. The insider hinted at documents, internal memos, correspondence, communications between the palace and Meghan's team that showed how much the institution knew. If those documents existed, they could expose not just Meghan, but the very monarchy she had supposedly turned her back on. And Meghan knew it. She could control photographs, press releases, even her husband. But she couldn't control leaks. Not from inside the palace. The world waited with bated breath for the insider to reveal more. And Meghan, trapped in a storm she could no longer spin, realized her options were shrinking by the day. Because when the palace begins to whisper against you, you're not just fighting a rumor. You're fighting an empire. And then, it happened. A photograph surfaced. A photograph no one was supposed to see. And what it showed threatened to blow everything wide open. The photograph was a spark in a room already soaked with gasoline. It didn't come from Meghan's glossy PR campaigns, nor from a paparazzi lurking outside Montecito. No, it came from somewhere far more dangerous. A leak. A rogue hand. And the moment it hit the press, the whispers about Lilibet turned into a roar. At first glance, it looked innocent enough. A candid shot taken in what seemed to be a hospital setting. The kind of image most families treasure in private, but rarely share with the world. But here's what made it explosive. Meghan wasn't in it. Harry wasn't in it. Instead, the woman who claimed to be Lilibet's biological mother was. She sat on a hospital bed, exhausted but radiant, cradling a newborn baby with the unmistakable reddish fuzz of hair and pale complexion that the world would later recognize as Lilibet Diana. No designer gown, no professional photographer, just raw, unfiltered life. The photo spread like wildfire across tabloids, social media, and international outlets. People zoomed in, analyzed, compared the baby's features to Lilibet's later photos. And the resemblance was uncanny. Too uncanny to ignore. For those already suspicious, It was the missing puzzle piece. Proof that Meghan had staged everything. Now let's pause here. Could the photo have been doctored? Of course. In an era where digital manipulation is everywhere, skeptics were quick to point out the possibility of Photoshop. But here's the kicker. The metadata checked out. Analysts claimed the timestamp, the location, and the hospital environment aligned with the date of Lilibet's supposed birth. If true, that meant this wasn't a fake. It was real. Meghan's camp scrambled. Her PR team immediately dismissed the photo as fabricated. They called it an invasion of privacy and accused the press of exploiting an innocent child. But the denial rang hollow. If the photo was truly fake, why not prove it with a forensic report? Why not sue the outlets for publishing it? Once again, Meghan stayed silent when she could have crushed the story. And silence, as before, looked like guilt. The public was divided. Some argued the photo was ironclad proof. Others believed it was a cruel trick staged by the woman to gain sympathy. But regardless of belief, the damage was done. The photo created a new kind of doubt. Not vague, not abstract, but visual. People had seen something. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. For Harry, the fallout was brutal. Insiders whispered that he was shaken to his core when the photo appeared. He had lived his entire life under the cloud of speculation about his own paternity. Now, it seemed history was repeating itself through his daughter. Imagine the torment. Looking at that photograph, seeing the uncanny resemblance, and wondering, even for a fleeting second, if the world was right. That kind of doubt doesn't just vanish. It festers. Meanwhile, the palace's role became harder to ignore. The leak of such a photo suggested that someone, somewhere, wanted the truth, or at least a version of it, to come out. And that someone had access to private, sensitive material. Which begged the question, was this photo part of a larger collection? Were there more images, more documents, more evidence hidden away, waiting to surface? Commentators drew comparisons to past royal scandals. They remembered how photographs of Diana, Princess of Wales, with her lovers had once rattled the monarchy. They remembered how private letters and recordings had found their way to the press, creating chaos. The pattern was clear. The crown thrives on secrecy, but every secret has a way of clawing itself into the light. And here's the irony. Meghan had once accused the palace of feeding negative stories about her to the press. Now, she faced the possibility that someone was doing the exact same thing again. Only this time the stakes were infinitely higher. But what really shook people was the look on the woman's face in that photo. It wasn't staged glamour. It wasn't a PR smile. It was the raw, exhausted joy of a mother holding her newborn for the first time. That emotion, the authenticity, was what made the image powerful. Because it's one thing to claim motherhood. It's another to see it in someone's eyes. And as the photo ricocheted across the world, Meghan's PR machinery sputtered. Every new image she released of herself with Lilibet was scrutinized, dissected, mocked as damage control. Every silence was interpreted as admission. Every denial was dismissed as spin. For the first time since marrying Harry, Meghan had lost control of the story completely. But the photo wasn't just damaging to Meghan. It was dangerous to the monarchy itself. If this woman truly was Lilibet's mother, then the monarchy had allowed a child with questionable lineage to be given a royal title. That wasn't just a scandal, it was a constitutional crisis. And the palace knew it. Behind the gilded walls, whispers grew louder. Could the monarchy survive if this was true? Could the crown endure another scandal of illegitimacy, of deception, of cover-up? Some courtiers reportedly urged Charles to distance himself from Harry and Meghan entirely. Others suggested a quiet, behind-the-scenes settlement with the woman to bury the story. But there was no burying it now. The photo was out there. The damage was done. And then, just when Meghan thought it couldn't get any worse, another revelation dropped. Because along with the photograph came something else, something tucked away in a file, attached like an afterthought. A signature. A document. A trace of the arrangement that tied Meghan directly to the woman. And once that surfaced, the scandal wasn't just about perception anymore. It was about proof. The photograph had set the world ablaze. But it was what followed that turned whispers of suspicion into a deafening chorus of accusations. Because along with the leaked image came another revelation, one that was impossible to ignore, one that transformed gossip into something that looked alarmingly close to evidence. A document. A signature. A contract. It wasn't a full agreement, not the kind of ironclad paperwork you'd see in a courtroom. But it was enough, a fragment, a page, something that looked official. And there, etched in black ink, was a name tied directly to Meghan Markle. The world gasped. If true, this wasn't just a rumor anymore. This was the thread that could unravel the entire tapestry, because it hinted at what the woman had been saying all along, that there was an arrangement, that there were promises made, and that Meghan had been directly involved. The document itself, of course, was contested. Meghan's team called it a fabrication, a cruel forgery designed to smear a mother. But analysts who examined it weren't so sure. The formatting matched known legal templates from California surrogacy arrangements. The language was precise, not sloppy. And the signature, whether real or expertly copied, looked almost indistinguishable from Meghan's verified handwriting. Now, think about the impact of this. For years, speculation about Meghan's pregnancies had been brushed aside as conspiracy chatter. But with the release of this document, suddenly those theories had teeth. Suddenly, there was something tangible, something people could point to and say, "See, we weren't imagining it. There's something here." And that's when the world began looking at Lilibet in a whole new way. Social media lit up with comparisons. Side-by-side images of the leaked baby photo, the biological mother, and later pictures of Lilibet. People zoomed in on the baby's features, the curve of her nose, the set of her jaw, the texture of her hair. They compared them not to Meghan, but to the woman in the photograph. And to many, the resemblance was striking. Now, let me ask you, if you saw a child who looked more like a mystery woman than the woman claiming to be her mother, wouldn't you at least pause? Wouldn't you wonder if the rumors were true? That's exactly what millions of people did. The online debate became a frenzy. Some users created entire threads breaking down Lilibet's features. Others pulled old footage of Meghan's public appearances during her pregnancy, re-examining every step, every bump, every angle. They slowed down videos where Meghan bent over and her stomach seemed to shift unnaturally. They analyzed how her maternity clothes appeared padded, how her bumps sometimes looked larger or smaller depending on the day. What once had been dismissed as gossip suddenly looked like evidence. And it wasn't just the public who noticed. Journalists began digging harder. Even mainstream outlets that had once steered clear of such speculation began cautiously reporting on inconsistencies. Words like surrogacy and secrecy began appearing in headlines. But here's where the story twisted into something darker. Because while the leaked document raised questions, it also raised fear. If Meghan and Harry had indeed entered into a surrogacy arrangement and then tried to conceal it, that wasn't just a PR scandal. It could be a legal one. In California, surrogacy is legal, but the rules are strict. Contracts must be filed properly. Legal custody must be established clearly. If any part of that process had been manipulated or concealed, Meghan and Harry could face serious repercussions. And yet, what terrified Meghan most wasn't the legal risk, it was the perception. Because Meghan's entire brand, her entire public identity, was built on her role as a mother. Every interview, every documentary, every speech, she wove in her children as symbols of her authenticity. If people believed she had lied about carrying her own daughter, that authenticity would shatter. The irony was brutal. Meghan had once accused the palace of stripping her of her voice. Now, another woman accused Meghan of stripping her of hers. The symmetry was impossible to ignore. But here's the cruelest twist of all. As much as Meghan tried to discredit the woman, there was something she couldn't erase. The woman's eyes in that hospital photo. Raw. Exhausted. Overjoyed. That expression carried more weight than any document ever could. Because you can fake signatures. You can manipulate paperwork. But the look of a mother holding her newborn for the first time? That's harder to dismiss. And so the world found itself trapped between two versions of the truth. On one side, Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, insisting through silence and carefully crafted PR that she was Lilibet's rightful mother. On the other side, a woman armed with photographs, documents, and a voice that grew stronger with every passing day. But then, just when it seemed the biological mother had the upper hand, something else emerged. A revelation that twisted the story yet again. Because while the public was busy analyzing documents and photographs, another set of records surfaced. Records that didn't just question Meghan's role. They hinted at the palace's hand in covering up the entire arrangement. And if those records were real, the scandal wasn't just Meghan's anymore. It was the monarchy's. The press smelled blood in the water, and Meghan Markle knew it. The release of the photograph and the document had sent her world into freefall. She had spent years carefully curating her image as a protective mother, a modern royal, a woman who had broken free from the suffocating palace system. But now, all of that was being dismantled in real time. And the media, the same media she once accused of destroying her, were circling like sharks. Lawsuits, she thought. That had always been her weapon. Meghan had sued newspapers before and won. But this was different. This wasn't a tabloid exaggerating a headline. This was a woman making a direct claim to her daughter. To sue her would mean opening the doors to discovery, documents, medical records, testimony. Evidence Meghan might not want anyone to see. So instead, Meghan doubled down on silence. But silence in the face of scandal is rarely golden. In fact, it becomes deafening. Every time Meghan refused to comment, every time Harry ducked questions, the press filled the void with speculation. Reporters dug into archives, looking for inconsistencies in Meghan's timeline. Talk show hosts debated the possibility of a surrogate. Social media buzzed with theories, memes, and amateur investigations. And then came the lawsuits, but not from Meghan. From the woman herself. She wasn't just talking now. She was acting, filing legal documents, stepping into the courtroom of public opinion with the weight of the law behind her. She claimed she had been silenced unfairly. She claimed her rights as a biological mother had been trampled. She claimed she had been erased, her role hidden, while Meghan paraded her child to the world. The headlines were brutal. Custody battle for Lilibet? Mystery woman takes Meghan to court. Who is Lilibet's real mother? And for Harry, this was hell. The thought of a custody battle, public, messy, dragging his daughter's name through headlines, was unbearable. He had fled the monarchy to shield his children from this very fate, and now he had led them straight into it. Friends whispered that he was drinking more, that his temper was flaring, that he looked more broken than ever. His loyalty to Meghan was unquestioned, but deep down, was he beginning to wonder if the world might be right? The legal angle was terrifying for Meghan, because in the United States, surrogacy is heavily regulated. If the woman could prove she had been coerced, underpaid, or misled, then not only could Meghan and Harry face public humiliation, they could face legal consequences. Custody, financial damages, and worse. And as the legal firestorm brewed, Meghan's PR machine kicked into overdrive. Glossy magazines suddenly ran features of her with the children, sunlit photos of her cuddling Archie, tender moments of her holding Lilibet. The message was clear. She was their mother, full stop. But the timing of those pieces made them look less like organic stories and more like damage control. The irony was impossible to miss. Meghan had once told Oprah she felt silenced by the palace. Now, she was being accused of silencing the very woman who may have carried her child. The roles had reversed. The narrative flipped, and the public saw through it. But here's where the story darkened further. Because the biological mother wasn't alone anymore. Other voices began to emerge. Anonymous insiders, supposed nurses, people who claimed to have been on the periphery of the arrangement. Their accounts varied, but the pattern was undeniable. Too many people were saying the same thing, that Meghan's pregnancy had never added up, and that the palace, far from being ignorant, had been complicit. The monarchy was dragged into the scandal headfirst. Charles, newly crowned, was said to be livid. William and Kate kept their distance publicly, but insiders whispered that William saw this as vindication, that Meghan's web of secrecy was finally collapsing. If the monarchy had covered this up, it wasn't just Meghan's scandal anymore. It was theirs, and the global press latched onto the angle with fury. Could the crown survive another illegitimacy scandal? Could it withstand the revelation that a royal child had been born under disputed circumstances? Comparisons were drawn to the infamous warming pan scandal of the 1600s, when a child was rumored to have been smuggled into the royal bedroom to secure a false heir. History, it seemed, was repeating itself. For Meghan, though, the worst was yet to come. Because as the woman's legal filings gained traction, something terrifying happened. She unveiled her trump card. Proof, she claimed, that Meghan had entered into the arrangement knowingly. Proof that Meghan had signed off on terms, only to later deny her existence. And when that proof was revealed, Meghan's world didn't just tremble. It cracked wide open. Because this wasn't just about scandal anymore. This was about the possibility that Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, could be exposed not as a victim of a ruthless monarchy, but as the architect of a ruthless deception. And the world was watching, waiting for the hammer to fall.